The docent at the Juno Beach Centre had a good voice for it. Clear, practiced, the kind of voice that carries well in an open room without needing to be loud. She was perhaps 28, with her hair pulled back under a Parks Canada cap, and she held her clipboard against her chest the way a person holds a shield. And she said, with the particular confidence of someone who has said the same thing 40 times this season, that the Lancaster on the South Wall had flown 2 training circuits out of Greenwood, Nova Scotia, before the war ended, and had never once crossed the Atlantic. The man on the bench near the exit heard every word. He was 81 years old. He wore a navy cardigan that had been washed so many times the elbows had gone pale, and brown trousers with a crease in them that suggested someone at home still ironed them for him, even though there had been no one at home to do that for 14 months. His hands rested on the knees of those trousers. He had a cane, wooden, plain, the kind you buy at a pharmacy rather than carve yourself, leaned against the bench beside him. He was drinking nothing. He was eating nothing. He had come in from the parking lot 40 minutes ago and had sat down and had not moved except to turn his head slowly, very slowly toward the Lancaster. The moment the docent said its name, his name was Gordon Aldridge. Not the Aldridges of any particular note. He had been a high school geography teacher in Truro, Nova Scotia for 31 years. He had a daughter in Halifax and a son in Calgary who called on Sundays when they remembered. His wife, Frances, had died the previous February. She had died on a Tuesday, which had been their grocery day, and now on Tuesdays Gordon Aldridge sometimes drove to places they had driven together, because the alternative was sitting in the kitchen watching the chair she used to sit in. His students had known him as quiet and a little distant and very precise about maps. They had not known that between September 1943 and April 1945, Gordon Aldridge had flown 31 operations as a wireless air gunner with 419 Squadron, Royal Canadian Air Force, out of RAF Middleton St George in County Durham. They had not known because he had not told them. He had not told his children either. He had told Frances, once in pieces, over the course of 3 long evenings in 1962, when she had asked him gently why he still flinched at the sound of aircraft at certain altitudes, and she had listened without speaking, and when he was done, she had taken his hand across the kitchen table and said only, "I thought it was something like that." After that, he had not spoken of it again. He had not come to the museum that morning to find anything. He had come because Frances had wanted to come, years ago, and they had never made it, and being there was the closest thing he had to being with her that Tuesday. But when he had walked in from the car park and come around the corner of the entrance hall, and seen the Lancaster hanging in the diffuse grey light of the atrium, he had stopped walking, just stopped. The way a man stops when he steps on a stair that isn't there. He had stood for a long moment and looked at her. She was painted in the dark green and black of Bomber Command night camouflage, and she hung at an angle from the ceiling on steel cables, nose tilted slightly down as if she were banking through cloud. She was not his aircraft. He knew that. His aircraft had been KB-726, and KB-726 had been lost over the Ruhr in November 1944, 3 weeks after Gordon had been taken off ops with frostbite in 2 fingers of his left hand. The crew he had trained with had died in her, all 5 of them, over a place called Gelsenkirchen on a night with no moon. This Lancaster was not KB-7, but she was the same marks, the same type, the same smell of cold metal and old paint that he could reconstruct from the inside of his chest without any effort at all, even after 56 years. He had found the bench and sat down and had been sitting there when the docent and her group of 14 tourists came around the corner. If you have ever watched someone you care about be diminished without knowing it, type the word remember in the comments right now, because what happened next in that museum in Normandy, Nova Scotia, was about an old man and a Lancaster and a docent with a clipboard, and it was about what we owe the people who did things we will never have to do. The docent's name was Amber Saulnier. She was good at her job. She cared about the history. The error she made was not an error of carelessness. It was an error of paperwork. The donation records for the Lancaster, which had come to the museum via a private collector in Moncton who had acquired it from a Crown Assets disposal in 1989, listed it as a post-war training airframe. The acquisition file was 4 pages, and the 4 pages said what they said, and Amber Saulnier had read them and remembered them and repeated them clearly and accurately to 41 groups of visitors since the spring. Gordon Aldridge waited until the group had moved toward the far end of the hall, toward the Bren gun carriers and the D-Day diorama. Then he stood, with some effort, retrieved his cane and walked toward the Lancaster. He did not look at the information panel mounted on the wall beside her. He did not look at the cutaway diagram of the fuselage posted near the nose. He walked, with the slow deliberateness of a man who knows exactly where he is going, to the port side of the aircraft toward the rear of the fuselage, and he stopped at a place just ahead of the tailplane where the skin of the aircraft had a seam in it that did not match the surrounding rivets. A repair, not factory work, field work. The rivets were slightly larger, the spacing slightly irregular, the way things are when a ground crew patches a hole at a dispersal point in the dark with their breath fogging and the next op already posted on the board. Gordon Aldridge put the flat of his hand against the repair. The aluminium was cold. Museum cold. The cold of a building, not the cold of altitude, not the cold of 22,000 feet over the Ruhr with the heating element in your flying suit gone unserviceable and your fingers going first numb and then wrong. But it was cold, and he held his hand there, and he closed his eyes, and he breathed in through his nose once, slowly, and let it out. Then he took his hand away and turned and walked toward the information desk near the entrance. The museum's deputy director was a man named Owen Veitch. He was 53, a former archivist, and he had a habit of eating his lunch at his desk and reading digitized unit diaries on his computer screen, which was how Gordon Aldridge found him when he knocked on the frame of the open office door. Owen Veitch looked up expecting a question about opening hours. What he saw instead was a man in a pale navy cardigan with red eyes and a hand resting on his cane that had not quite stopped trembling. "Sir," Owen Veitch said, and started to stand. "I won't take much of your time," Gordon Aldridge said. His voice was quiet. It was not the voice of a man who was going to cry or shout or make a scene. It was the voice of a man who had spent 31 years asking 16-year-olds to please take out their atlases. "I'd like to see the provenance file for the Lancaster if you have it, and I'd like to show you something if you don't mind." Owen Veitch did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the old man in the doorway. He looked at the hand on the cane. He said, "Of course," and reached for his keys. He came back with a thin manila folder. He laid it open on the desk. Gordon Aldridge looked at the 4 pages. He looked at them for a long time in the way that people look at documents that are wrong about something they were present for. Then he reached into the inside breast pocket of his cardigan and took out a small notebook. It was a Hilroy, the kind Canadian schoolchildren used for decades, with the red maple leaf on the cover, and it was old enough that the cover had gone soft and dark at the corners. He opened it to a page near the middle and laid it on top of the provenance file. The page had a hand-drawn diagram. It was a side profile of a Lancaster fuselage, drawn in pencil with a ruler, with an X marked on the port side aft of the mid-upper turret. Beside the X, in the small, meticulous handwriting of a man who taught geography and measured everything twice. Repaired March 1944, Middleton, St. George. Krupke's crew, flak from Essen, came back in the port elevator. Patch job in the dark. Took 3 ground crew 4 hours. They used rivets from a Category E they'd cannibalized the week prior, slightly oversized. You could tell by feel in the dark. Below the diagram a column of names. 7 of them. Flying Officer R.S. Alcott, Navigator. Sergeant W.D. Bauer, Bomb Aimer. Sergeant L.J. Steen, Flight Engineer. Sergeant M.D.A. Thieser, Mid-Rear Gunner. Sergeant C.H. Vance, Wireless Air Gunner, which had been Gordon himself in a crew that had borrowed the aircraft 4 times before KB-726 was assigned to them permanently. And at the top of the column, in slightly different ink, as if added later, Krupke's crew, all killed, 14 Nov 1944 Gelsenkirchen. Owen Veitch looked at the notebook. He looked at the provenance file. He looked at the old man standing on the other side of his desk. He picked up the phone. Amber Saulnier came to the office, still holding her clipboard. She stopped when she saw the elderly man in the visitor's chair, and she stopped again, more slowly, when she registered that Owen Veitch was standing rather than sitting, and that his hands were very still on the desk in the way hands go still when a person is being careful. Gordon Aldridge did not look at her immediately. He said, in the tone of a geography teacher who is not angry, only factual, "The Lancaster on your south wall has a patch on the port fuselage, aft of the mid-upper turret. The rivets are oversized and the spacing is irregular because the ground crew at Middleton St. George used parts from a scrapped airframe. That was done in March of 1944 after the aircraft came back from Essen with flak damage to the port elevator. I know this because I was in that aircraft 4 times, and because the wireless air gunner who was in her, when the flak hit, wrote about it in detail. That was Sergeant Charles H. Vance, and he was my bunkmate, and he died in November 1944 in a different aircraft over Gelsenkirchen. And the last letter he wrote home was to his mother in Antigonish, and I mailed it for him because he asked me to before we went on separate ops that week. The room was quiet. The aircraft on your wall, Gordon Aldridge said, is not a training hull. Amber Saulnier sat down in the second visitor's chair. She did not do so consciously. Her knees made the decision without consulting her. Owen Veach said very quietly, "How long have you known?" Gordon said, "Since I walked in this morning." There was a pause. Then Owen Veach asked if Gordon would be willing to speak to the group, not just Amber's group, all of them. "Anyone in the building?" He asked it carefully. The way you ask something of a person you are not sure has the energy for it. Gordon Aldridge looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the car park was grey under an overcast sky. It looked like the kind of Tuesday in February when Francis would have suggested they drive somewhere, just to drive. "Yes," he said. "All right." Owen Veach used the PA system. Amber went to collect the visitors still in the main hall. A retired schoolteacher from Amherst who had come in out of the rain. A couple from Ontario who were doing the Cabot Trail and had detoured. 2 young men with a university sticker on their backpack who had been photographing the Bren carriers. An older woman, perhaps 70, who had been sitting alone in the reading alcove with a paper bag lunch, and who looked up with the alert, careful eyes of someone who has learned to pay attention to rooms. They gathered in the reading room at the back of the building, 14 chairs, most of them filled. Gordon Aldridge sat at the front with his cane across his knees and his Hilroy notebook on the small table beside him, and he did not wait for silence. When there were enough people settled, he simply began. He told them about 419 Squadron. The Moose Squadron, he said, though he said it without drama, the way a man says the name of a place he lived for a long time. He told them about Ralph Middleton St. George in the winter of 1943, which was cold in a way that he had never successfully explained to anyone who had not been there. A cold that came up from the airfield concrete and through the floor of the Nissen hut and through the blanket and into your back while you were trying to sleep before an op. He told them about the crew he had crewed up with in the traditional bomber command way, which was no formal assignment but a loose milling about of newly arrived aircrew in a hangar who were expected to sort themselves out, as if war were a barn dance and you had to find your own partner. He had found Charles Vance in that hangar. Vance had been from Antigonish, 18 years old, the youngest wireless op in their intake, and he had had a habit of whistling the same 4 bars of Anne Murray's Snowbird, or what would become Snowbird, because Murray hadn't recorded it yet, but Vance had heard a version somewhere and carried it in his head. Gordon had found this intensely irritating for 6 weeks and had then found, one morning, that he had begun to do it himself. He told them about the Essen operation in March of 1944, when they had borrowed the Lancaster on the south wall from Krupke's crew because their own was unserviceable, and had come back with flak in the elevator and a 2-inch hole in the port fuselage that had let the cold in for the last 40 minutes of the flight and had caused Sergeant Paquet, the mid-upper gunner, to use language that Gordon had never heard in sequence before. He told them about the ground crew, 4 men working by torchlight and swearing quietly, who had patched the hole before morning with oversized rivets from a Lancaster that had come back from Dusseldorf the previous week in bad enough shape that she'd been written off for parts. He told them about Vance. He told them about the letters Vance wrote to his mother in Antigonish. Long letters, careful letters, letters that described the English countryside and the food in the mess and the sound the Lancaster made at high altitude but said nothing about where they were going or what they had seen. Vance had explained this once. He had said, "She worries, no sense making it worse with the details." Gordon had thought at the time this was a reasonable approach. He thought so still. He told them about November 14th, 1944. He said it plainly. He did not look away from the room when he said it. He had been taken off operations 2 weeks earlier with the frostbite in his left hand, and Krupke's crew had needed a wireless op, and Vance had gone with them to Gelsenkirchen in a Lancaster called the Longest Way Round and had not come back. Krupke's crew had not come back. The aircraft had not come back. None of it had come back. Gordon had heard about it at breakfast the next morning when the ground crew for the Longest Way Round came in from the dispersal point, and one of them, a young corporal from Manitoba, had put his tray down at the table next to Gordon and said quietly, Crook's lot didn't make it back, sir, and Gordon had said, I know, and he had finished his powdered eggs. Because that was what you did. You finished your powdered eggs and you went on your next op. He told them he had mailed the letter to Vance's mother in Antigonish, as Vance had asked. He had never heard back. He had not expected to. He had thought about the family in Antigonish sometimes, over the years. He had thought about it more in the last 14 months, since Francis died, because grief has a way of surfacing other griefs, old ones you'd thought you'd settled, and grief in particular tends to find the faces of the people you couldn't save. He told them about walking into the museum that morning and seeing the Lancaster. He told them about the patch. He said very quietly that when he had put his hand on it, he had thought about Paquet swearing in the mid-upper turret. He said that had felt, in some way he could not properly explain, like seeing someone you'd lost a long time ago. The reading room was very still. There was a woman in the third row who had been holding a paper coffee cup since the beginning of Gordon's account, and the cup had been full when she sat down, and it was still full now, because she had not moved. Owen Veitch was not taking notes. He had taken out his phone and was recording, quietly, with the phone rested on the edge of the table. He had not asked permission. He would ask afterward, and Gordon would say he didn't mind. When Gordon finished, the room was silent for what seemed like a full minute. Then the woman who had been sitting alone in the reading alcove with her lunch, the one with the careful eyes, raised her hand. She said her name was Lila Beaumont Forrest. She said her father had been ground crew with 405 Squadron out of Gransden Lodge. She said he had never spoken about it either, and had died in 1997 without speaking about it, and that she had been trying, in the years since, to understand what that silence had cost him, and that she had come to the museum today because she came every year on the anniversary of the day her father enlisted, which was today, and that she had not expected to hear anything like this. She looked at Gordon Aldridge and said, simply, "Thank you." Gordon looked at her for a moment. He said, "Your father's crew would have known my crew. The squadrons shared the same airfield for 4 months in 1944. Lila Beaumont Forrest put down her coffee cup. In the weeks that followed, Owen Veitch contacted the Air Force Heritage Network in Trenton. A researcher named Sergeant Elaine Ramsey began cross-referencing the aircraft's stamped frame serial number, which was still legible on a main spar, against 6 Group RCAF maintenance records. The oversized rivets were photographed. Gordon's diagram was scanned. The repair log from Middleton St. George, archived in Ottawa, was located. It matched date, aircraft, damage description, parts source, ground crew shift. The provenance file was corrected. Amber Saulnier rewrote the wall panel herself. She brought a draft to Gordon's kitchen table on a Saturday morning in October, and he read it carefully the way he had read student work for 31 years, and he made 2 corrections. He corrected the spelling of Gelsenkirchen, which she had gotten slightly wrong, and he added, at the bottom of the panel, a line about Charles Vance, wireless airgunner, Antigonish, Nova Scotia, age 19. They sat at the kitchen table after, and Amber asked questions, and Gordon answered them, in the careful, unhurried way of a man who taught for 31 years and knew that the only thing worth doing with a person who finally wanted to learn was to give them the time to learn properly. Lila Beaumont Forrest found, through the Air Force Heritage Network contact that Owen Veitch had provided, the name of a historian in Halifax who had been researching 405 Squadron for 8 years. The historian had a file on her father that Lila had not known existed. The file included a citation that her father had never mentioned. He had been awarded a mention in dispatches in March 1945, which is a quiet recognition, the kind that does not come with a medal ceremony, just a line in a gazette and a letter to the unit. Her father had received the letter, had apparently read it, had apparently placed it in the back of his service logbook, which Lila had had in a box in her hallway closet since 1997, and had never opened all the way to the end. She opened it all the way to the end. At the Juno Beach Centre now, the Lancaster on the south wall has a new information panel. It names the squadrons that operated her type. It names the raid from which she returned damaged in March of 1944. It names the ground crew shift that made the repair, so far as the maintenance record allows. And it carries a small secondary panel beside the main text, a white card in a black frame that reads, "This aircraft was identified by Warrant Officer, Ret. Gordon P. Aldridge, 419 Squadron RCAF, who flew in her 4 times in 1944. He recognized the repair on her port fuselage from the cold of the flight home from Essen. He came to this museum on a Tuesday in October because his wife used to like Tuesday. Gordon's daughter in Halifax saw the new panel on a visit in December. She called him that Sunday instead of waiting for him to call. She talked for a long time. He answered in the short, careful sentences he had always used, and when she asked him why he had never told her any of it, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said what most of them said, the ones who came home. He said, "It didn't seem like it needed telling." She said, "Dad," he said, "I know. The bench near the exit at the Juno Beach Centre is not dedicated to anyone. It is just a bench, the kind of bench that is in every museum, there for tired feet and slow readers and people who need a moment. On certain Tuesdays, when the October light comes through the tall windows the way it does in Nova Scotia. Pale, particular, not warm exactly, but present. There is sometimes an old man on that bench in a navy cardigan, with a plain pharmacy cane and no coffee, watching school groups come in through the entrance and walk into the atrium and look up at the Lancaster for the first time. They always look up. Everyone looks up at her. And sometimes the children reach out to touch the information panel, the way children touch things they are trying to make real. Some of them run their fingers over the name Gelsenkirchen. Some of them run their fingers over the name Antigonish, and some of them, when they reach the small white card at the bottom and read it, look around the museum as if the old man it describes might still be there. He usually is. He usually is.